The air in Lower Manhattan does not smell like the ocean, despite the island being held in the embrace of the Atlantic. In October of 1907, it smelled of unrefined bituminous coal, the acrid sweat of 3 million immigrants, and the metallic temps of horse manure grinding against cobblestones under the friction of iron carriage wheels. But if you were to walk past the unremarkable, squat building at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, a structure of pale, imposing limestone that refused to reach for the sky like its ambitious neighbors, you would find that the air changed. Here, at the epicenter of the American experiment, the atmosphere was sterile, cold, and smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. This was 23 Wall Street. It bore no sign above its door. It required none. If you did not know who lived inside, you had no business crossing the threshold. It was known simply as the corner. And inside sat a man who did not merely possess money. He possessed the gravitational pull that kept the American solar system from flying apart into the void. To understand the terrifying fragility of the world before the Federal Reserve, one must first dismantle the modern conception of safety. Today, we exist in a financial reality cushioned by safety nets, insurance corporations, and a central banking system that acts as a lender of last resort, a theoretical bottom to the abyss. In 1907, there was no bottom. There was only a jagged, terrifying freefall. The United States was a feral economic giant, an industrial leviathan with the cardiovascular system of a mouse. It was a nation of unparalleled steel output, of railroads that stitched the continent together like surgical sutures, and of oil refineries that blackened the skies with the smoke of progress. Yet its banking system was archaic, decentralized, and prone to seizures that could stop the heart of commerce in a single afternoon. There was no government agency to print money when liquidity dried up. There was no regulatory body to inspect the ledgers of the shadow banks. There was only the whimsical cruelty of the market, and the singular, brooding will of John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was 70 years old. He was a man carved from the same granite that built the city, physically imposing, with a gaze that was famously described by photographers and rivals alike as the high beams of a locomotive bearing down on you in a tunnel. He suffered from rhinophyma, a skin condition that deformed his nose into a purple, bulbous mass, a physical imperfection that he carried with a terrifying dignity. He hated being looked at, yet he commanded every room he entered. He was semi-retired, weary of the relentless friction of the marketplace, spending his days hoarding the history of Europe manuscripts, tapestries, and Renaissance paintings, trying to buy the permanence that eluded mortal men. He wanted to be left alone with his art, but the chaos of the unguarded American economy would not let him rest. The storm that was gathering over New York City in the autumn of 1907 was not meteorological, it was psychological, a contagion of fear that would start with a whisper and end with the near-total collapse of Western civilization's liquidity. The catalyst for the apocalypse was not a war, nor a famine, but the hubris of a few minor men playing God with copper. We must look at the texture of this hubris. It started with F. Augustus Heinz, a man who treated the stock market not as a mechanism of capital allocation, but as a baccarat table. Heinz had made a fortune in the copper wars of Montana, fighting the establishment with a guerrilla tactician's mind, but in New York, he was an outsider, a rough-hewn gambler in a tuxedo that didn't quite fit the stiffness of his posture. He believed he could corner the stock of the United Copper Company. To corner a stock is an act of financial violence. It requires buying up the entire available supply of shares to force those who have bet against it, the short sellers, to buy it back from you at whatever price you dictate. It is a stranglehold, it is a siege. And like all sieges, if the walls do not hold, the besieger is slaughtered. Heinz, along with his brother Otto and the equally reckless banker Charles W. Morse, began their assault on the market on a Monday. The room where they plotted was likely filled with the blue haze of expensive cigars, the air thick with the manic energy of men who believe they have solved the equation of luck. They leveraged everything. They borrowed money they did not have to buy shares that were not worth the paper they were printed on, driving the price of United Copper from $37 to nearly $60 in a matter of hours. For a brief, intoxicating moment, they were kings. The ticker tape machines, those glass-domed oracles of the age that chattered incessantly in every brokerage office, pat out the numbers that confirmed their genius. But a corner is a delicate, artificial construct. It defies gravity. And the gravity of Wall Street is heavy, ancient, and unforgiving. The establishment, the smart money, realized the game was rigged. They stopped playing. The short sellers did not panic. They simply found other sources of copper stock, or they waited. The price of United Copper didn't just fall, it evaporated. It collapsed from $60 to $10, shattering the Heinz fortune in a blink. But the destruction of one man's wealth is a tragedy. The destruction of the system that held that wealth is a catastrophe. The problem was not that Heinz was bankrupt. The problem was where Heinz had kept his money. He was the president of the Mercantile National Bank. In the incestuous, unregulated architecture of 1907 finance, the failure of a man meant the suspicion of his institution. The depositors, the shopkeepers, the widows, and the businessmen did not care about the technicalities of the short squeeze. They only knew that the man who ran their bank was a gambler who had just lost everything. Fear is a liquid. It seeps under doors and through the cracks of confidence. It moves faster than the telegraph. By Tuesday, the lines had begun to form. A bank run is a uniquely physical manifestation of economic theory. It is the crowd psychology of panic-made flesh. Men and women, dressed in their heavy wool coats against the October chill, stood in lines that wrapped around the block, clutching passbooks, their eyes darting nervously at the locked doors of the Mercantile National Bank. They demanded their gold. They demanded their paper. They demanded the tangible proof that their labor had not been in vain. When a bank pays out to a line of panicked depositors, it is bleeding. It is hemorrhaging liquidity. If the bleeding is not stanched, the bank dies. And when one bank dies in a system without a Federal Reserve, it is not an isolated death. It is the first domino in a chain reaction that leads to the Stone Age. The contagion jumped. It leaped from the Mercantile National Bank to the trust companies. We must pause here to dissect the trust company, a financial invention that was the true villain of this drama. Trust companies were the shadow banks of the Edwardian era. Unlike traditional national banks, which were required to keep 25% of their deposits in cash reserves, a safety buffer, mandated by law, trust companies were regulated by a looser, state-level code. They kept almost no cash. They were designed to manage estates and inheritances, but they had evolved into aggressive, speculative commercial banks that took high risks to offer high interest rates. They were bloated ticks on the side of the economy, engorged with the public's money but lacking the skeletal structure to survive a blow. And the biggest, most prestigious of them all, was the Knickerbocker Trust Company. The Knickerbocker was a palace of finance. Its headquarters at 34th Street and 5th Avenue was a Roman temple, designed by Stanford White, with marble pillars that whispered of eternity and stability. It was the bank of the new rich, the socialites. The people who felt that the old dusty banks of Wall Street were too slow for the pace of the 20th century. Its president, Charles Barney, was a man of connections, a man who moved through the salons of New York with the ease of a diplomat. But Charles Barney had a fatal flaw. He had been an associate of Charles Morse, the co-conspirator in the failed Copper Corner. Guilt by association is a powerful toxin in a market driven by perception. The whisper started in the clubs and the tea rooms. Barney is exposed. The Knickerbocker is rotten. On the morning of Tuesday, October 22nd, the Knickerbocker Trust Company opened its bronze doors to a siege. The crowd was not a polite gathering of clients, it was a mob. The lobby, a cavernous space of marble and brass intended to inspire awe, became a suffocating crush of bodies. Tellers, their faces pale and sweating behind their cages, shoveled out bundles of cash as fast as their hands could move. The sound in the room was a low, terrifying raucous sound of collective despair. Millions of dollars were flowing out the door, carried away in satchels, in pockets, in hats. The bank's liquidity was draining away like water from a smashed vase. Barney called his friends. He called the other bankers. He called for help. But the telephone lines were cold. The establishment, the old guard of Wall Street, viewed the trust companies as upstarts, as reckless cowboys who were finally getting their comeuppance. They hesitated, and in that hesitation, the fate of the nation was sealed. By noon, the Knickerbocker had paid out $8 million in cash. By 12:30, the vaults were empty. The great bronze doors were heaved shut, locking out hundreds of people who were still screaming for their life savings. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest financial institution in New York City, had suspended operations. The shockwave was instantaneous. If the Knickerbocker could fail, nothing was safe. The panic went viral. It spread to the Trust Company of America, to the Lincoln Trust, to banks in Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco. The credit markets froze. Stock prices on the New York Stock Exchange began to plummet, not because the companies were failing, but because everyone was selling everything to raise cash. Cash was king. Cash was God. And cash was nowhere to be found. It is here, in the midst of this spiraling disintegration, that we must pause. We are observing the anatomy of a collapse, dissecting the necrosis of a financial system that had grown too large for its own primitive heart. We study these moments not merely to catalogue the errors of the dead, but to understand the cyclical nature of human greed and fear. This channel is dedicated to that excavation, to the slow, deliberate unearthing of the stories that shaped the bedrock of our reality. We do not skim the surface. We drill until we hit the nerve. If you wish to accompany us into these depths, to ensure that these documentaries continue to be produced with the rigor and darkness they deserve, I invite you to subscribe. It is a small gesture, a click of a button. But in the economy of attention, it is the currency that allows us to keep the lights on in the archives. Join us. The city was now teetering on the edge of anarchy. The police were deployed to guard the banks, their horses pushing back crowds that were growing increasingly desperate. There were rumors of riots. The unimaginable was happening. The checks of reputable businesses were being refused. Payrolls could not be met. The intricate web of credit that allowed a baker to buy flour and a railroad to buy coal had snapped. The bloodstream of the economy had coagulated. In Washington, D.C., the politicians were helpless. The Treasury Department had some funds, but no legal mechanism to inject them efficiently into the places where they were needed most. The President, Theodore Roosevelt, a man who had built his reputation on busting trusts and fighting the malefactors of great wealth, found himself in a humiliating position. He realized that the government of the United States was impotent. He could charge up San Juan Hill, he could wrestle bears, but he could not stop a bank run. There was only one power on earth that could stop the bleeding. J.P. Morgan was at a church convention in Richmond, Virginia, when the telegrams began to arrive. They came in a flurry, frantic strips of paper describing a city in flames. He read them with the detached stoicism of a general reviewing casualty lists. He knew this would happen. He had warned them. He had told the trust companies that their lack of reserves was a suicide pact. But there was no "I told you so" in Morgan, only a grim acceptance of duty. He boarded his private train car, a rolling palace of velvet and mahogany, and ordered it north. The train tore through the night, a streak of iron and steam cutting through the darkness of the Atlantic seaboard. Inside, Morgan sat alone, playing solitaire. This was his method. The chaos of the world could be organized, sorted, and conquered, just like the cards on the table. He was not merely returning to New York, he was returning to take command of the country. When he arrived at Jersey City, the station was swarming with reporters, their flashbulbs popping like lightning in the gloom. He ignored them. He crossed the Hudson River on a ferry, the skyline of Manhattan looming ahead of him like a fortress under siege. He was met by his son, Jack Morgan, and a phalanx of lieutenants. They briefed him as they drove to his brownstone on Madison Avenue. The situation was worse than the telegrams had suggested. The Trust Company of America was next. If it fell, the dominoes would reach the national banks, and then the stock market would close, perhaps forever. The wreckage would be total. Morgan listened, his eyes half closed, his breathing heavy. He was an old man, and he had a heavy cold. He should have been in bed. Instead, he went to his library. The library. We must speak of the room itself. It was not an office. It was a sanctuary. Designed by Charles McKim, the library was a space of intimidating beauty, filled with the smell of leather-bound incunabula and the silent gaze of Renaissance Madonnas. The walls were lined with triple-tiered bookcases made of walnut. A massive fireplace dominated one end, always burning, even when the weather was mild, because Morgan was always cold. In the center of the room sat his desk, a throne from which he would judge the worthiness of men and institutions. That night, the library became the war room of American capitalism. The bankers came to him. They did not go to the White House. They came to the library. They arrived in their carriages, men who controlled the destiny of millions. The presidents of the First National Bank, the National City Bank, the Hanover National Bank. They were proud men, titans of industry. But they entered Morgan's presence like schoolboys called to the headmaster's office. They were terrified. They brought with them their balance sheets, their ledgers, their tales of woe. Morgan sat in a wingback chair, smoking a cigar that seemed to be an extension of his own volcanic will. He listened. He did not speak much. He simply absorbed the data. He was calculating the burn rate of the panic. How much money was needed to stop the run on the Trust Company of America? 10 million. 20. He dispatched teams of auditors, young men with sharp eyes and sharper pencils, to the Trust Company of America in the middle of the night. Their orders were simple. Go through the books. Find out if the assets are real. If the bank is insolvent, if it is truly broken, we let it die. We do not throw good money after bad. But if the bank is solvent, if it is merely suffering from a lack of cash but has real value in its vaults, then we fight. The auditors worked through the night, their fingers stained with ink, their eyes burning from the smoke and the fatigue. Morgan waited. He played solitaire. He stared into the fire. He was deciding who would live and who would die. This was the terrifying power of the man. There was no committee, no vote, no democratic process. One man, an unelected private citizen, was deciding the fate of the U.S. economy based on his own intuition and the reports of a few exhausted accountants. If he gave the thumbs up, the bank would be saved. If he gave the thumbs down, the line outside the Trust Company of America would turn into a riot, and the panic would consume everything. As dawn broke over the city, gray and bleak, the auditors returned. The news was mixed, but there was a pulse. The Trust Company of America had assets. It was liquid, barely. It could be saved, but the cost would be astronomical. Morgan stood up. The fatigue seemed to fall off him. He turned to the gathered presidents of the national banks, men who were hoarding their own cash, terrified of lending it out. Morgan's voice was a low growl. You will subscribe, he told them. You will put up the money, $10 million. Now, it wasn't a request, it was a command from the emperor. They looked at each other, hesitating. They hated the trust companies. Why should they save their rivals? Morgan fixed them with that locomotive gaze. If they fail, he said, you are next. The wall falls on everyone. The $10 million that J.P. Morgan had wrestled from the clenched fists of the bank presidents did not fix the problem. It merely bought a few hours of breathable air in a room that was rapidly filling with carbon monoxide. To visualize the speed at which capital was vanishing, one must imagine a furnace. The panic was not a static event. It was a metabolic process, a voracious engine that consumed liquidity and excreted terror. The lines, outside the Trust Company of America, did not disperse. The depositors stood in the rain, a grim, serpentine procession of bowler hats and wet wool, shuffling forward inch by agonizing inch toward the tellers' cages. Inside, the clerks were working with the frantic mechanical precision of men bailing water from a sinking ironclad. They were not counting money anymore. They were shoveling it. The sheer physicality of the currency exchange was exhausting. Hands cramped, fingers bled from paper cuts. The piles of gold coin and greenbacks, which represented the accumulated labor of thousands of lives, were handed over the counter and disappeared into the pockets of the mob, effectively exiting the economy. When money goes into a mattress, it ceases to be blood, it becomes a clot. By Thursday, October 24th, the infection had migrated from the banking halls to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. If the banks were the heart of the economy, the exchange was its nervous system, and it was suffering a grand mal seizure. The mechanism of the stock market relies on call money, short-term loans, that brokers use to facilitate trades. Without call money, the gears grind to a halt. There are no buyers. There are only desperate sellers screaming into a void. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Ransom Thomas, the president of the exchange, crossed the street to Morgan's office. Thomas was a man witnessing the end of his world. He walked into Morgan's office, his face the color of old parchment, and delivered the news that sounded like a death sentence. "Mr. Morgan, we have no money. The rate for loans has hit 100%, and still, there is no money. I have to close the exchange." To close the exchange early was unthinkable. It would be an admission of total defeat, a signal flare to the rest of the country and to Europe that the American experiment had failed. It would trigger a panic that would make the previous days look like a garden party. Morgan looked at Thomas. He did not blink. "You will not close the exchange," Morgan said. It was not a debate. It was a statement of fact, bending reality to his will. "You will stay open until the bell rings at 3 o'clock. Morgan then orchestrated one of the most dramatic scenes in financial history. He did not use a telephone, he walked. He left his office at 23 Wall Street and walked across the wet gray pavement to the offices of the bank presidents, who were, by now, hiding in their boardrooms like frightened children during a thunderstorm. The sight of J.P. Morgan walking in the open street, amidst the chaos, had a galvanic effect. The crowds parted. Men stopped shouting. It was as if a leviathan had surfaced in the harbor. He was visible. He was present. He was not hiding. He gathered the bank presidents against Tillman of National City, Baker of First National, and the dialogue was stripped of all pleasantries. The time for negotiation had passed. "We need $25 million, Morgan said. "And we need it in 10 minutes. The bankers balked. They complained about their reserves. They complained about the risk. Morgan pointed a finger at the clock on the wall. The second hand was sweeping towards the abyss. "If the exchange closes," he told them, his voice a low rumble of gravel and smoke, "your banks will be gone by tomorrow. There will be no reserves left to protect." The logic was brutal and irrefutable. It was the logic of an amputation. Cut off the leg to save the body. They capitulated. The money was pledged. At 2:15 p.m., just as the final vestiges of hope were evaporating on the trading floor, the news arrived. The announcement was shouted from the rostrum. J.P. Morgan had released $25 million in call money at 10% interest. The roar that went up from the floor was not human, it was primal. It was the sound of drowning men suddenly finding the surface. Brokers wept openly. They threw their hats in the air. In the span of 15 minutes, the money was loaned out, greasing the seized gears of the machine. The market stabilized. The bell rang at 3 o'clock. The exchange had survived, but the beast was not dead. It was merely sleeping, and its appetite was growing. The crisis had revealed a terrifying truth. The United States of America, the rising industrial superpower, was functionally insolvent. As the weekend approached, a new specter emerged from the fog. The city of New York itself, the municipal corporation, responsible for the police, the firemen, the teachers, the sanitation workers, was broke. The city needed $30 million to meet its payroll obligations. If the city defaulted, if the police stopped being paid in the middle of a financial riot, the social contract would dissolve. The anarchy would move from the ledges to the streets. The mayor came to Morgan. The controller came to Morgan. It was a scene of profound humiliation for the concept of democratic governance. The elected officials of the greatest city on earth were kneeling before a private citizen, begging for an allowance. Morgan sat in his library, surrounded by his Gutenbergs and his Caxtons, and wrote a check. He didn't write it from his own account. Even his wealth had limits, but he orchestrated a syndicate to buy the city's revenue bonds. he essentially underwrote the government. He printed his own credibility on the back of the city's debt. "This must stop," he muttered to his associates. He was exhausted. He was 70 years old, suffering from a severe cold, sleeping 3 hours a night, and carrying the weight of the entire Western Hemisphere on his shoulders. His doctors warned him that he was killing himself. He ignored them. He sat in his chair playing solitaire, the cards snapping down on the leather snap imposing order on chaos, one card at a time. The weekend brought no respite. The focus of the infection shifted again, this time to the brokerage firm of Moore and Schley. This was the most dangerous phase yet. Moore and Schley was heavily invested in a specific stock, the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company TC&I. They had used millions of dollars of TC&I stock as collateral for loans from banks. Now, the banks were calling in those loans. If Moore and Schley couldn't pay, they would have to dump the TC&I stock on the market. The price would crash. If the price crashed, the banks holding the stock as collateral would be insolvent. It was a Gordian knot of debt that threatened to strangle the last remaining solvent institutions in New York. And here is where the story descends into the realm of the operatic. Morgan realized that throwing money at the problem was no longer enough. The hole was too deep. He needed a structural solution. He needed to lock the doors. On the night of Saturday, November 2nd, Morgan summoned the city's leading trust company presidents to his library. This was not a meeting. It was an incarceration. He gathered the men who controlled the trust companies, the very institutions that had started the panic, and ushered them into the East Room. Then, he walked out and locked the door. He literally pocketed the key. The symbolism was medieval. They were prisoners of his will. In the library, the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and fear. These were wealthy men, accustomed to deference, now trapped in a gilded cage, stripped of their autonomy. Morgan retired to the West Room, away from the noise of their bickering. He sat at his desk, playing solitaire. He let them sweat. He let the silence of the night press down on them. He knew that if he stayed in the room, they would argue with him. But left alone with each other, and with the terrifying reality of the locked door, they would eventually break. He was not negotiating. He was waiting for their surrender. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The atmosphere in the East Room became suffocating. Men loosened their collars. They paced the floor, their footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. They stared at the tapestries on the walls, depictions of the triumph of avarice, perhaps, or the fall of man, and wondered if they would leave this room with their fortunes intact. Morgan's plan was simple, but brutal. The stronger trust companies would put up $25 million to save the weaker ones. They had to bail out their own brethren to save themselves. They hated the idea. They didn't want to risk their own solvency for the sake of their competitors, but every time they tried to leave, they found the heavy oak doors barred. At 3 a.m., Morgan entered the room. He walked in with a piece of paper in his hand. It was the agreement. He placed it on the table. He did not give a speech. He did not plead. He pointed to the paper and said, "Sign." There was a long, agonizing silence. Edward King, the head of the Union Trust Company, and the leader of the group, looked at the paper. He looked at Morgan. He looked at the tired, desperate faces of his colleagues. He realized there was no other way out of the room. He picked up the pen. The scratching of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the world. King signed, then he passed the pen to the next man. One by one, they signed their names to the document, pledging millions of dollars they did not want to spend, bound by the sheer force of Morgan's presence. But as the dawn of Sunday approached, a final, insurmountable obstacle remained. The bailout of Moore and Schley depended on a merger. U.S. Steel, the giant corporation Morgan had founded, proposed to buy the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company to save the brokerage firm. It was a brilliant maneuver. U.S. Steel would acquire a valuable competitor for pennies on the dollar, and the cash would save Moore and Schley, which would save the banks, which would save the economy. It was a masterstroke of disaster capitalism. However, there was a man in Washington who had made his career destroying exactly this kind of deal. Theodore Roosevelt. The purchase of a major competitor by U.S. Steel would be a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. If Morgan went ahead with the deal, Roosevelt's Justice Department could sue, nullifying the contract and throwing the market back into chaos. They needed the president's permission to break the law in order to save the country. Sunday night, the private train was prepared again. Frick and Gary, two of us Steel's titans, boarded the Midnight Express to Washington, D.C. They had to reach the White House before the market opened on Monday morning. They were racing against the sun. The fate of the American economy was now speeding down the rails towards the Capitol, carried in the briefcases of two exhausted industrialists who had to convince a populist president to bless a monopoly. Back in the library, Morgan waited. The city outside was quiet, a deceptive calm before the potential storm. He had played every card he had. He had bailed out the banks, he had bailed out the exchange, he had bailed out the city, and he had coerced the trust companies. Now, he was gambling on the political will of his greatest adversary. He sat in the vast, silent room, the fire dying down in the grate, the shadows lengthening across the floor. He was the uncrowned king of America. But in that moment, he was just an old man waiting for a phone call, wondering if the structure he had spent a lifetime building was about to collapse under its own weight. The telephone ringing in the library at 23 Wall Street was not merely a mechanical sound. It was the shrill, jagged cry of the 20th century interrupting the 19th. On the other end of the line, the news was relayed from Washington, D.C. The gamble had paid off. The envoys of Steel, Henry Clay Frick and Elbert Gary Pett, had successfully navigated the pre-dawn gloom of the Capitol to stand before the President of the United States. We must visualize this scene to understand the capitulation it represented. Theodore Roosevelt, the trustbuster, the Rough Rider, the man who had built his political mythology on the premise that no corporation was above the people, was forced to swallow the bitterest pill of his presidency. He was interrupted at breakfast, the smell of coffee and bacon mingling with the existential dread of a national collapse. He listened to the proposition. U.S. Steel would absorb its competitor, creating a monopoly so vast it defied the very laws Roosevelt had sworn to uphold. In exchange, the panic would end. Roosevelt looked at his Attorney General, Charles Bonaparte. He looked at the window where the sun was rising over a country that was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. He did not give his blessing in writing. Politicians rarely sign their own death warrants, but he gave his assent. He agreed to sheath the sword of the Justice Department. He agreed to look the other way. It was a gentleman's agreement, a phrase that sanitizes the reality of what occurred. The suspension of the rule of law for the sake of market stability. The message was flashed back to New York just minutes before the opening bell of the stock exchange. The deal was done. The Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company was purchased. The brokerage firm of Moore and Schley was saved. The banks that held the collateral were solvent. The levies held. When the market opened on that Monday morning, the selling pressure evaporated. The atmosphere on the floor of the exchange shifted from the hysterical panic of a slaughterhouse to the exhausted relief of a battlefield after the ceasefire. Prices stabilized. Then, slowly, tentatively, they began to rise. The panic of 1907 was technically over. But as the adrenaline faded, leaving the bankers and the brokers shivering in the cold light of survival, a new and perhaps more dangerous sensation began to take hold. It was not gratitude. It was resentment. For 3 weeks, the United States of America had ceased to be a democracy. It had functioned as a financial monarchy, ruled by a single despot operating out of a private library in Manhattan. John Pierpont Morgan had performed a miracle. Yes. He had saved the economy from reverting to a barter system. He had saved the payrolls of millions of workers. But in doing so, he had revealed a terrifying truth that the American public could not unsee. The government was impotent. The Treasury was a hollow shell. The true power lay not in the White House, but in the hands of a private citizen who could lock the country's wealthiest men in a room and force them to do his bidding. Morgan was not a villain in this story. He was the hero, but he was a hero of a kind that a free republic cannot tolerate. He was a titan, and titans are dangerous because they are unaccountable. The aftermath of the panic was a long, slow exhale that turned into a growl. As the months passed and the wreckage was cleared, the narrative shifted. The press, which had hailed Morgan as a savior in November, began to ask uncomfortable questions in December. Why did one man have this much money? Why did one man control the switches of the railroad, the furnaces of the steel mills, and the vaults of the banks? The term money trust began to appear in the headlines, capitalized and sinister. It referred to a cabal of bankers. Morgan, Rockefeller, Kuhn, Lobo were suspected of controlling the entire credit system of the nation. The fear was no longer about losing money. It was about losing liberty. If a small group of men could save the economy at their whim, they could also destroy it at their whim. They held the kill switch of civilization. This shift in public sentiment is critical. It explains why the Panic of 1907 is the most important event in American financial history. It was the trauma that broke the resistance to central banking. For decades, Americans had hated the idea of a central bank. They remembered the Bank of England as a tool of oppression. They remembered Andrew Jackson destroying the second bank of the United States. To the American mind, a central bank was a tool of tyranny, a centralization of power that was un-American. But the Panic of 1907 proved that the alternative, the chaotic, unregulated madness of the Wildcat era, was worse. The country realized it needed a fire department. It could no longer rely on a benevolent neighbor with a bucket. The political response was clumsy but inevitable. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Freeland Act, a band-aid measure that allowed for the issuance of emergency currency during crises. But more importantly, it established the National Monetary Commission. This was a body tasked with studying the banking systems of the world to design a replacement for the American antique. The man placed in charge of this commission was Senator Nelson Aldrich. We must pause to examine Nelson Aldrich. He was the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller. He was the embodiment of the East Coast establishment, a senator so deeply in the pocket of big business that he was practically a subsidiary of Standard Oil. He was known as the general manager of the nation. He was J.P. Morgan's man in Washington. The fox was not only guarding the henhouse, he was being asked to design the security system. Aldrich spent 2 years touring Europe, dining with the heads of the Bank of England, the Banque de France, and the Reichsbank. He marveled at their stability. In Europe, when a bank wobbled, the central bank stepped in quietly, injected liquidity, and the problem vanished. There were no riots, there were no mobs. It was civilized. It was controlled. Aldrich returned to America, convinced that the United States needed a central bank. But he also knew that if he proposed it openly, it would be dead on arrival. The public hated him. They hated the banks. Any plan with the name Aldrich on it would be burned in effigy by the populists and the farmers of the West. The plan had to be written in secret. This brings us to the most conspiratorial, yet historically verified, moment in the genesis of the Federal Reserve. It is a scene that sounds like the opening of a spy novel, but it is documented fact. In November of 1910, 3 years after the Great Panic, a private railroad car was attached to the rear of a southbound train in Hoboken, New Jersey. The blinds were drawn. The car belonged to Nelson Aldrich. Inside were 6 men. They were instructed to come separately. They were instructed to use only their first names. They were told that if asked by reporters, they were going on a duck hunting trip. The men were the architects of the New World Order. There was Aldrich. There was a Piatt Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. There was Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank. There was Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Company. There was Charles Norton, President of the First National Bank. And, most importantly, there was Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg is the intellectual father of the Federal Reserve, a German Jewish banker who had immigrated to America. He was a partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co. He was the only man in the room who actually understood how a central bank worked mechanically. He looked at the American system with the horror of a trained engineer looking at a steam engine held together with duct tape and prayers. He had been preaching the gospel of central banking for years, often to deaf ears. Now, trapped in a train car with the most powerful men in the country, he had his audience. The train rattled south, through the industrial wastelands of New Jersey, through the tobacco fields of the Carolinas, finally stopping at the Brunswick coast of Georgia. A boat took them across the water to an exclusive, private retreat, the Jekyll Island Club. Jekyll Island was a playground for the higher elite. It was said that 1/6 of the world's wealth was represented by the club's membership, but in November 1910, the club was empty, save for the staff and the 6 conspirators. For 10 days, they secluded themselves in the clubhouse. They worked in secret, terrified of discovery. If the press found out that the leading bankers of Wall Street and the leading politicians of Washington were writing the banking laws in a private resort, the country would explode. They worked for 18 hours a day. The room was filled with smoke and the murmur of debate. Lectured Aldrich argued politics. Davison protected Morgan's interests. They were trying to solve an impossible equation. How do you create a central bank that looks like it belongs to the people, but is actually controlled by the bankers? How do you create a centralized power in a country that fetishizes decentralization? The solution they crafted was a masterpiece of camouflage. They would not call it a central bank. That name was toxic. They would call it the Federal Reserve System. It would not be one bank in Washington. It would be 12 regional banks scattered across the country: Boston, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, to give the illusion of local control. But the power would rest with a central board. The currency it issued would not be banknotes. It would be Federal Reserve notes, implying the backing of the government. It was a brilliant hybrid, a private corporation with a public facade, a quasi-governmental agency that answered to Congress but was owned by its member banks. It was designed to prevent the very thing that had happened in 1907, the reliance on one man. It institutionalized the role of J.P. Morgan. It took the power of the library and embedded it into the law. While the conspirators were hunting ducks and drafting legislation on Jekyll Island, the old lion was dying. J.P. Morgan's health had never recovered from the stress of 1907. But before he passed into history, he had to endure one final humiliation, a public stripping of his mystique that would serve as the funeral rite for the era of private finance. In 1912, the Peugeot Committee, a congressional subcommittee investigating the money trust, summoned Morgan to testify. The scene in the committee room in Washington was electric. The air was hot and crowded. Morgan, now 75, frail but still terrifying, sat in the witness chair. He was being interrogated by Samuel Untermeyer, a brilliant, aggressive lawyer who wanted to expose the secret web of control that Morgan spun. Untermeyer hammered him with questions about monopolies, about the consolidation of credit, about the power he held over the nation. He wanted Morgan to admit that he controlled the economy. But Morgan, in his final public act, turned the tables. He did not speak of balance sheets or interest rates. He spoke of something far more archaic. Is not commercial credit based primarily upon money or property? Untermeyer asked, setting a trap. Morgan leaned into the microphone, his voice rasping. But clear: no, sir. The first thing is character. Before money or property? Untermeyer asked, stunned. Before money or anything else, Morgan replied. Money cannot buy it. A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. It was a statement of profound philosophical weight. Morgan was arguing that the financial system was not a machine of math, but a network of trust between honorable men. He was defending the world that was dying, the world of the handshake, the world of the gentleman's agreement, the world where a single man's character could stop a panic. He did not understand, or perhaps he refused to accept, that the world had grown too large, too complex, and too cold for character to matter anymore. The modern world demanded systems, not men. It demanded the cold, impersonal machinery of the Federal Reserve, not the warm, flawed, tyrannical judgment of a king in a library. Morgan died a few months later in Rome, in his sleep. The news flashed across the Atlantic. Wall Street did not panic. The stock exchange closed for 2 hours in tribute, but there was no crash. The system held, and in Washington, the legislation that had been born in the smoke-filled rooms of Jekyll Island was moving through Congress. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson on December 23, 1913, just months after Morgan's death. It was the end of the era of the Titans, and the beginning of the era of the technocrats. But, as we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, we must ask the question that hangs over this entire history like a shroud. We replaced the tyranny of Morgan with the tyranny of the Fed. We replaced the chaotic, terrifying panics of the 19th century with the slow, managed inflation of the 20th. We traded the risk of immediate death for the certainty of chronic disease. The library at 23 Wall Street still stands. The building is still there, low and squat, scarred by shrapnel from a bombing in 1920 that has never been solved. It is a tombstone for a way of life. The room where Morgan locked the bankers in, the room where the fate of America was decided by a game of solitaire, is empty. But if you listen closely to the silence of the financial district on a Sunday morning, you can almost hear the echo of the lock turning. We are now living in the house that Morgan built, renovated by the men of Jekyll Island. The paint is peeling. The foundation is cracking. And there is no one left in the library to answer the phone. To stand before the Eccles Building in Washington, D.C., today, the headquarters of the Federal Reserve, to stand before a paradox carved in white Georgia marble. The structure, completed in the late 1930s, is stripped of the ornamentation that defined the age of Morgan. It is a simplified, stripped classicism, a style that projects a sterile scientific authority. It does not look like a bank. It looks like a temple to a deity that demands no burnt offerings, only the silent, invisible sacrifice of purchasing power. The men and women who walk its halls today do not possess the purple, bulbous nose of J.P. Morgan, nor do they carry the terrifying, singular will of a man who owns the room. They are PhDs, they are econometricians, they are the high priests of a religion called monetary policy, a faith that believes the chaotic, feral nature of human exchange can be tamed by the adjustment of a dial, by the tweaking of a basis point, by the digital creation of liquidity ex nihilo. But as we peel back the layers of history, as we dissolve the marble facade with the acid of hindsight, we find that the ghost of 1907 is not dead. It has merely changed its clothes. The Federal Reserve, the creature from Jekyll Island, was sold to the American public as a shield against panic. It was promised as the antidote to the money trust. Yet, in a supreme irony that would make Machiavelli smile in his grave, the system created to destroy the power of the bankers ended up cementing it for eternity. Under Morgan, the bankers had to bail out the system with their own capital. If they failed, they lost their fortunes. There was a visceral, terrifying skin in the game. Under the Federal Reserve, the bankers are bailed out by the public. The risk has been socialized, diffused among the millions of taxpayers who will never step foot inside a boardroom, while the profits remain privatized, concentrated in the hands of the few who understand the alchemy of leverage. We must look at the ledger of the last century not with the eyes of a consumer, but with the eyes of a coroner. What died so that the Federal Reserve could live? The first casualty was the value of the currency itself. When Morgan stopped the panic, a dollar was a specific weight of gold. It was a physical reality. Today, a dollar is a Federal Reserve note, a debt instrument, a promise to pay nothing but another promise. Since the creation of the Fed in 1913, the US dollar has lost over 96% of its purchasing power. This is not an accident, it is a feature. It is the slow, invisible tax of inflation. The silent termite that eats the foundation of savings while the house looks perfectly painted from the street. The stability we bought with the death of the panic of 1907 was purchased with the slow, agonizing euthanasia of the saver. And what of the panics themselves? Did the creature kill the beast? For a while, it seemed so, but then came 1929. Then came the stagnation of the 1970s. Then came the dot-com bubble. And then, exactly 101 years after Morgan locked the doors of his library, the beast returned with a vengeance that shook the pillars of the earth. The 2008 financial crisis was a haunting, frame-by-frame reenactment of 1907, played out on a stage of fiber optic cables and credit default swaps. Bear Stearns was the Knickerbocker Trust. Lehman Brothers was the trust company of America, the one they let die to send a message. And who played the role of Morgan? It was Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed, a scholar of the Great Depression, and Henry Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, a former CEO of Goldman Sachs. They gathered the heads of the major banks in a room, this time at the Treasury Department. Not a private library, and they presented them with a fait accompli. But there was a critical difference. When Morgan demanded money, he looked into the eyes of men and demanded their money. When Paulson and Bernanke demanded money, they were signing checks drawn on the future labor of the American people. They injected trillions, not millions. They saved the system, yes. The ATMs kept working. The trucks kept delivering food. But in doing so, they validated the darkest fears of the populists of 1910, that the financial system had become a sovereign entity, independent of the host, capable of extracting infinite resources to preserve its own existence. This brings us to the uncomfortable question that lies at the bottom of the abyss. It is a question of human nature versus systems. J.P. Morgan was a flawed man. He was arrogant, he was a monopolist, and he operated with a disdain for the democratic process. But he was human. He had a code, character, he said. Before money or anything else, he believed that a banker's word was his bond, and that a failure of honor was worse than a failure of liquidity. The system that replaced him, the bureaucratic, algorithmic, sterilized machinery of central banking, has no character. It has only mandates. It has no shame. It has only targets. So, I ask you to descend into the comments section below and cast your vote in the court of public opinion. Which is the lesser of two evils? Do you prefer the benevolent tyrant, the singular strong man like Morgan, who acts with decisive, brutal force, but puts his own skin in the game? Or do you prefer the invisible machine, the committee of experts who manage the economy from the shadows, insulated from the consequences of their errors, slowly devaluing your life's work in the name of stability? Does the environment of easy money corrupt the man, or does the corrupt man create the environment? Let the debate begin in the dark. As we conclude this autopsy of the panic of 1907, we must recognize that we are still trapped in the east room of the library. The door is still locked. The key is in the pocket of history. We are waiting for the dawn, playing cards, hoping that the men in charge know what they are doing. But the room is getting smaller. The debt is getting larger. And the voice of Morgan, that gravelly, smoke-choked growl, is long gone. The legacy of 23 Wall Street is not just a story of money, it is a story of how the world really works. It is the story of the deep state before there was a name for it, not a conspiracy of lizards or aliens, but a conspiracy of competence, a conspiracy of men who believe that the average citizen is too fragile to handle the truth of how close we are to the edge. They build walls of complexity to hide the drop. They print paper to cover the cracks. But gravity, like J.P. Morgan, always gets its way in the end. The panic of 1907 was the last time the market was allowed to scream. Since then, it has been sedated. But sedation is not a cure. It is merely a delay. And when the patient finally wakes up, when the drugs wear off and the printing presses run out of ink, the withdrawal will be unlike anything we have ever seen. The next crisis will not be solved in a library. It will not be solved by a gentleman's agreement. There are no gentlemen left. If this deep dive into the architecture of power has unsettled you, if it has made you look at the dollar in your pocket with a new suspicion, then we have done our job. But the story does not end here. The creation of the Federal Reserve was just the foundation. The house that was built upon it, the Roaring Twenties, the shattering Depression, and the rise of the surveillance state, is a labyrinth of even darker corridors. To understand what happened when the machine finally broke, when the scientific system failed to stop the greatest collapse in history, You must understand the tragedy of 1929. It wasn't just a crash. It was a murder mystery. Click here to watch the day the music died, the true story of the Great Depression, and continue the descent. The library is closed, but the nightmare is just beginning.